What's going on, everybody? Welcome back into the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel. My name is Lucas Wencl, and today we are talking about 10 players that you can look to drop after week 12 of the NFL season to make room for those waiver wire ads ahead of week 13. As always, we'll cover guys both in deep leagues and shallow leagues, but before we dive on into that list, if you want a chance at winning a signed Josh Allen Bills helmet for free, courtesy of our friends at pristineauction.com, all you need to do is head to fantasypros.com/contest, complete the form, and either download the Fantasy Pros Draft Wizard app, leave a review for the podcast, or follow us on X, Instagram, or TikTok at Fantasy Pros. The more actions you complete, the more entries you receive. We'll be announcing a winner right here on the podcast, so if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications so you can be alerted when new episodes are up and to come claim your prize when we announce it. Kicking off our list this week is Denver Broncos running back Audric Estime. Sean Payton gave us optimism 2 weeks ago, giving Estime 14 carries against the Chiefs while playing 45% of the snaps. Since then, though, he's absolutely pulled the rug out from underneath us, giving Estime a total of 12 touches over the last 2 weeks, while seeing his snap share dip down to 23% in week 11, and playing only 5 of a possible 68 snaps in week 12. The Audric Estime experiment may be over already, I fear. From a fantasy perspective, he hasn't given you more than 5.5 fantasy points in any game this year, including his 14-touch game against the Chiefs. And the Broncos' run game, well, it's far from impressive. Even in the deepest of leagues, it's tough to make the case that you're stashing Estime for quote-unquote upside, and the Broncos' bye week is still coming up in week 14. He can be sent to the waiver wire in all league formats. The next player you can look to drop this week is Pearsall, wide receiver for the San Francisco 49ers. Slick Rick has now given you back-to-back goose eggs and is clearly the 4th or even 5th option in this passing attack if you want to include Christian McCaffrey. The rookie out of Florida has shown flashes of big play potential in week 10 against Tampa Bay, but the 49ers get a gauntlet of difficult matchups down the stretch. They drop Buffalo, Chicago, and Miami in 3 of their next 4 games, who are all bottom 8 in fantasy points per game allowed to wide receivers this year. If you want to keep Pearsall stashed in the deepest of leagues, you can, but in your standard 12 to 14 man leagues, you can look to part ways with him for whoever you may want off the waiver wire. Unless you're playing in a 2-quarterback or superflex league, you can look to drop New York Jets quarterback Aaron Rodgers. If you held on to Aaron Rodgers through the bye week, you're not being rewarded whatsoever. Reports have been coming out that the Jets may place Rodgers on IR for the rest of the season or even cut him at this point. As of this recording, none of that has come to fruition yet, but what incentive is there for Rodgers to still be on your fantasy roster? Going into the bye, he had finished outside of the top 20 quarterbacks in back-to-back games, while throwing for less than 200 yards in each of those contests. And the icing on the cake, Rodgers has only given you 2 weekly finishes as a top 12 quarterback this year. The roster spot he currently takes up on your team can be utilized significantly better, so ditch Aaron Rodgers and add some fresh depth to your team as the fantasy playoffs inch closer. Another quarterback you can look to drop in single quarterback leagues is Trevor Lawrence of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Trevor Lawrence made my list last week, and nothing has changed coming out of their week 12 bye. The team is 2-9 with their most recent loss being by 46 points to the Detroit Lions. Despite the numerous reports, Doug Peterson is still the head coach for this team, and there's no updated news on how healthy Trevor Lawrence actually is. It's entirely possible the Jaguars shut down their $275 million quarterback for this season with less than a 1% chance to make the postseason per NFL.com. Lawrence has only given you 3 top 12 finishes in 9 games this year, and has primarily been a streaming option most of the season. If you're holding onto him as a backup, it's time to part ways and fill out your roster better for the fantasy playoffs. Our next player that you can drop this week is Tyjae Spears, running back for the Tennessee Titans. Tyjae Spears has had a tough time staying on the field recently, missing weeks 7 through 9 with a hamstring injury and now missing week 12 with a concussion. He should be able to return to action in week 13, but Washington is quietly 9th in schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs over the last 5 weeks, meaning they're actually allowing fewer points than expected to the position. Boil in the fact that Spears has only given you 2 weekly finishes inside of the top 30 running backs, and he becomes someone that you might be actually willing to part ways with. In deeper leagues, Spears is still worth stashing, but in shallow leagues, Spears is a fine cut candidate for whoever you're eyeing on the waiver wire. The next player to consider cutting is Cleveland Browns running back Jerome Ford. Since returning in week 9 from injury, Ford is averaging only 4.4 fantasy points per game. This is largely due to Nick Chubb's return, limiting Ford to 5 or less rushing attempts in each game after averaging 9.6 attempts per game through the first 5 weeks of the season. Prior to Monday Night Football, Ford is currently the running back 33 for Week 12, but don't be fooled, he only scored 3.7 fantasy points against the Steelers on Thursday Night Football. Looking ahead, the schedule isn't exactly a walk in the park either. He draws the Steelers again in Week 14, followed by the Chiefs in Week 15, and then gets Cincinnati, Miami, and Baltimore to close out the season. In shallow leagues, you're better off stashing direct handcuffs to your running backs instead of Jerome Ford, so take a gander at your waiver wire and see who's available. Up next on our drop list is Tyler Lockett, wide receiver for the Seattle Seahawks. It appears the tides have fully turned towards JSN taking over as the wide receiver 2 for this team, making Tyler Lockett a droppable piece on your fantasy team. Week 12 marked the 4th straight game where Lockett has seen 4 or fewer targets and the 4th straight game of 3 or fewer receptions. He's finished as the wide receiver 63 or worse in 3 of his last 4 games, and salvaged a wide receiver 23 finish in Week 9 because of a touchdown. With DK Metcalf back in the lineup as well, Lockett's piece of the pie will remain small, and he's certainly not startable at this point. With the fantasy playoffs nearly here, there's other valuable pieces to stash ahead of Tyler Lockett, so you can drop him in shallow leagues and even some deep leagues if there's other players on the waiver wire you feel would benefit your team better. The next cut candidate we're going to talk about is Miami Dolphins running back Raheem Mostert. It's over for Raheem Mostert in Miami, I fear, plain and simple. He's only had 5 total rush attempts over the last 3 weeks. He's only gained 3 rushing yards on those 5 attempts, and over the last 2 weeks, you and I have as many total yards as Raheem Mostert, with 0. Raheem Mostert's fumble in Week 9 was the final nail in the coffin, as the Dolphins have elected to make Jalen Wright the secondary ball carrier to Devon Achane. He got 7 carries to Achane's 10 against the Patriots this last week. If you want one more reason to drop Raheem Mostert, his schedule coming up absolutely stinks, getting the Jets twice, the Texans, and Browns in 4 of their last 6 games. Raheem Mostert should be dropped in almost all league formats except for the deepest of leagues where he's a 1 injury away kind of stash. Moving on to the tight end position, you can part ways with Dalton Schultz of the Houston Texans this week. There was originally optimism for Dalton Schultz to see an increased role after Stephon Diggs suffered a torn ACL, and Nico Collins was still dealing with his hamstring injury. Unfortunately, though, time has run out with Nico Collins back in the lineup and Joe Mixon continuing to be the engine for this Texans offense. Schultz did give you 2 top 15 finishes over the last 3 weeks, but those are his only 2 finishes better than the tight end 20 this year. Schultz finished as a tight end 26 with Nico Collins fully inserted back into the lineup this week, so Schultz could be dropped in all league formats with little to no upside rest of season. And lastly, you can consider sending Denver Broncos running back Javonte Williams to the waiver wire this week. This one is for those of you playing in the shallowest of leagues, and honestly, it still may be hard to part ways with Javonte after he gave you hope with 18 fantasy points against the Falcons in Week 11. This is the trend we're seeing with Sean Payton though, right? His running backs give you hope and then he pulls the rug out from under you the next week. Now, Javonte did lead the team in snaps, routes run, and carries against the Raiders this past week, but it amounted to -2 rushing yards and only 4 receiving yards on the afternoon. As I mentioned with Audric Estime, the Broncos still have their bye in Week 14 coming up, which is killer if you're trying to make a playoff push in your league. In most league formats, you're holding on to Javonte, but with the Browns, Chargers, and Chiefs coming up in 3 of their last 5 games, it's not looking great for Javonte in shallow leagues. Alrighty, y'all, that's it. That's all I've got for you here today, but before we sign off, remember, if you want a chance at winning a signed Josh Allen Bills helmet for free, courtesy of our friends at pristineauction.com, all you need to do is head to fantasypros.com/contest, complete the form, and either download the Fantasy Pros Draft Wizard app, leave a review for the podcast, or follow us on X, Instagram, or TikTok at FantasyPros. The more actions you complete, the more entries you receive. We'll be announcing a winner right here on the podcast, so if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications so you can be alerted when new episodes are up and to come claim your prize when we announce it.